Hi, this is Nancy Rolfsma with On Point TV and Quilting with Nancy. Thank you very much for joining us for our next session, working our way through the Great Lakes Voyage. So far we have taken you through the Mariner's Compass and the reverse applique, and it's now time to start the blanket stitch applique. So on the quilt, this is the blanket stitch applique section. And in this next segment, I'm going to talk to you about how to make the bias cables for the flowers and how to prepare your backing. It's really important to prepare your backing properly when it comes to machine applique. I hope you enjoy this. So now that the center of our quilt is all squared up, we are ready to tackle blanket stitch applique. So far, I think in the first learning to quilt, I taught you invisible machine applique. I've also taught you hand applique, not needle turn. That'll come in some future episode. But we did do a little bit of that with the reverse applique. This is the first time that we've done anything with blanket stitch applique. There's a lot of little steps to it, and I'll kind of tell you about each one as we go. But we're going to start with the bias cable. So this is what our piece is going to look like. It's actually going to be a long piece, and I'll tell you about the background here in a minute. But we're going to cut the bias cable. When I do blanket stitch applique, if I've got, these are all a fusible, but the bias stem, I am not going to do that as a fusible. I'm not going to cut out the piece on the fusible that's actually curved. Instead, I'm going to create a bias stem just like we did in the cable of the learning to quilt, and very, very much like we did in the quilted tiles. So if you ever want to know a whole lot more about the bias cables and ways that you can do them, you might want to search on the On Point TV channel for quilted tiles. That one has some very, very intricate designs that you design all by yourself, and that even makes it more better. Right? So we're going to start for this quilt. You only need an 18-inch long bias stem. And I want to tell you that in the book, show you how to do the fold so that you're actually getting a really long bias stem, and you can cut quite a few of them. But for this quilt, you really don't need that. You only need an 18-inch bias stem, which means here is just kind of a scrappy, this would be, let's say this is a fat quarter, all right? So from the fat quarter end here, okay, there's my one. Right. If I'm putting this on the 45-degree angle, I can take it all the way over to here. So it's almost like I only have to cut off a corner of a fat quarter. So if you don't want to go through the entire folding to make a lot of bias stems, you don't have to. Just take a piece of fabric that is at least, this one's 15 inches wide at this point because I've chopped some off. And with that 45-degree angle here at the bottom, I'm going to have an 18-inch long bias stem. So I'm going to be able to cut that. Now I've got bias. Now for this quilt, we are making a 1/2-inch bias stem. In the previous videos, we've always dealt with 1/4-inch bias stems. This time, we're going to have them be a thicker stem. So for a 1/2-inch bias stem, I need to cut my bias strip 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to line this up at 1.5. And there you go. I would need to cut 4 for this particular quilt, but I'm just going to work with 1 for now. Let's put these all away, and we're going to now go to our sewing machine. So at the sewing machine, I have just my regular foot set up on my machine with my cotton thread here for the stitching. And you need to figure out now where to put your needle for the 1/2-inch bias stem that you're creating. So there's 2 ways you can do it. On my machine, I can lower my foot so that the foot is now on the edge of the bias stem. And then I can move my needle over to the left. So if you can I'm hoping that you can actually see it. But I can move my needle on this machine till it goes just to the left of the bias bar. But what if you don't have the ability to move your needle over? So for this, what you're going to do, there we go, lift up your presser foot, and I want you to set your foot so that it is just, so that the needle is now going just down to the left of your bias stem, and then place your guidelines for quilting. Oops, there it is. Those little sticky guys that I use for my 1/4 inch bias, my 1/4 inch seam allowance, you would take him and stick him down right next to the bias stem. So because I usually move my needle over, and that's what you see me do, this time I'm going to pretend my machine can't move its needle over, and we'll do it this way. So this will be my seam. Now I can remove the bias bar and pull out the bias strip that I had cut. With the bias strip, you want to fold it in half, wrong sides together. So this is the right side of the fabric. You will line it up so that the fold of the fabric is right here next to the guidelines for quilting. Lower your needle and start sewing. So the trick here is to try to keep that fold next to the guidelines so that you know that it's the right size. Now I gotta tell you, the next thing I do, I might sew about that far, then I'm going to test it and make sure. So using the bias bar, I'm going to push it inside and go, oh yeah, that fits good. I don't want it too tight. I don't want it too loose. That is sliding in very, very nicely. So that means I can continue sewing this entire stem. There. So I've sewed my entire stem, and remember, this only has to be 18 inches long, so it's not a really, really long one. I got to tell you that the 1/2 inch size, he is thicker, and it looks so cool. So if you make a larger quilt, you could actually add, just with a simple border on a larger quilt, using a 1/2 inch stem to make something like a cable going around the quilt. Looks really, really cool. You might want to think about doing that on your next quilt. With the 1/2 inch size, we do not have to trim that seam. We're going to keep that seam just like it is because it'll be skinny enough to hide behind the bar itself. So with this, now I'm going to shove the tube that I made onto the bias bar. And when I'm doing that, I want to make sure that the seam, the actual stitching line, is below the top of the bias bar and that the seam itself is facing toward me. So from the top, I cannot see the edge of that seam. So take your time and push it all the way onto the bias bar. Then get out your iron. And my iron is nice and hot, but I want to take off the steam. If you work with the steam on this, yeah, you're likely to burn yourself, and I don't want you to do that. So as I take the stem or the bias tube off of the bar, I am pushing my iron to press it. Okay. And it's coming off nice and easily. If it's coming off too tight, that means that you've made your seam too big or too small, but you do not want that stem to be tight. You don't want to have to force it as you're pulling it off. Okay. So now we have it finished, just a little bit more. And always after I press it from the back side, then I'll turn my steam back on and press it from the front side. I want to make sure that my edges are very crisp. So there, we have our bias stem for our applique done. Next, we're going to prepare the backing fabric. We need to now prepare the backing fabric for your blanket stitch applique. And I want to make a blanket statement here. When it comes to any machine applique, and I've mentioned this before many times, if you're doing blanket stitch applique, if you're doing raw edge where you're just going to stitch around the edges, if you're doing invisible machine applique, you need to prepare your backing fabric by spray sizing it quite stiff. The only way you can get around that is if you actually apply a stabilizer to the whole thing. And honestly, I've not found that to be very helpful when it comes to the end, because then you have to try and tear it off and it's just no fun. So this piece of fabric, I have spray sized twice with my Mary Ellen spray sizing, and you will see that it is really rather stiff. So that's the first thing. So that means when I spray it, I am not dusting the fabric. I am not just misting it a little bit. I am saturating the fabric, pressing it completely dry, and then saturating it again and pressing out completely dry. I know that seems like a little overkill, but trust me, you will be so happy with your end result if you will do that. So with this piece, with this particular quilt, instead of cutting one really long piece, we're going to seam it right down the middle because there's a flower and so it covers it in anyhow. But the fabric that I have chosen for the quilt that I'm making now has a stripe going all the way through it. So let me show you again with the applique done. Do you see that stripe going all the way through? Now, can you imagine if when you got your strips cut that the stripe actually wasn't straight, but that it was actually tipping down and not being very straight? That would be so not pretty. I'm going to call it that, not pretty. So you want to be sure, and with this quilt, the instructions tell you to do it to cut at the length of grain anyhow, but when there is a stripe, you must cut it so that the length of grain. Now this particular fabric, the stripe is running along the length of the grain, which is the selvage edge. But keep in mind, sometimes that stripe might run the width of fabric. If you're doing a fabric that has the width of fabric, the stripe running the width of fabric, you do not want your long lines to run the long length of the applique. You would then want the lines to be running vertical in the applique, so they would just be little short ones. Then you wouldn't be able to notice whether or not the lines were perfectly straight or not. But if you choose to be brave and find a fabric that you want with this, where the line is actually running along the selvage, this is the way you want to cut it. So I'm going to fold this in half, and I'm kind of folding it so that it's not one on top of another, because I want to make sure that with the design that those lines are still folded up. Now it should be, if you line up your selvage edge, you should be good. But really, do you want to trust it to that? Probably not. So if you'll fold it like this so you can see those lines, then using your large ruler, you can line it up on the horizontal, on the fold of your fabric. And I'm going to line this one up right there. And that cut is perfectly fit with the design on both sides. Now I'm going to turn it around. And for this quilt, I need 2 8-inch wide strips to piece them together. I actually need like an extra long one for the quilt, but I've decided, like I mentioned, to not just do it as one big long piece. It ended up having a lot of wasted yardage that way, and with the seam being covered, it didn't matter. So since I'm going to need to sew the 2 pieces together, I want to be sure that my design is going to be able to match up. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to scooch this up here a little bit so that I know that it's going to match up. Although it is cut quite a bit bigger than it needed to be cut. So this time, that's an 8 1/8, so that I've got that top edge. Now I can just spin it around and trim that up to 8 inches. So using the design of my fabric, telling me how to cut my strips. So to make this one extra long, if you will lay them right sides together, looking again. So if I offset this a little bit, I can see if my design line is matching up, and it is. Then I want to square this end off. Then I will take this to my sewing machine and I will sew that and then press the seam open. So then I will have one really long piece. There's my seam right here, and here it didn't match up, but that's okay. I wanted those lines to match up, so that's what mattered. So I've now got one very long piece to do my blanket stitch applique design on. My background fabric to my applique is prepared in terms of that I have stiffened it up with the spray sizing and I've sewed it all into one big long strip. The next step is to put the registration marks on your design so you kind of know where the boundaries are for your applique. I am not a big fan of when you're doing applique that you exactly place everything exactly where it's supposed to be, especially because most of the applique I do is going to involve flowers. Now, I have been a gardener for a long, long time. My family owns a nursery. I work with the flowers all the time. And here is a truth I can tell you. You cannot predict where your flowers are going to grow. You cannot predict how high they're going to grow. You cannot predict if they're going to bend in one way. So when it comes to applique, I like it to be a little bit freer. I am never going to be a big fan of you must place the entire piece down and place it exactly where I did. Now in the pattern, for this particular pattern, you do have that option, but I would rather you were a little bit free with it. So when you're working with that concept, the freedom of placement, you do have to have registration marks. How far can you go to the top, to the bottom, and to the left? Where are those flowers going to generally be placed? So for this quilt, it is going to end up being a 6.5-inch finished applique border, which means you want to mark your section for 5.5 inches. Not 6.5, because you don't want your applique coming all the way. So if we're looking, let me see, let's look at this one here that is finished. You don't want those applique sections to come all the way down to the seam. You want to be sure that there's minimum of 1/4 inch from the seam to your applique elements. So if you will mark your registration mark to be 5.5 inches, then you will know that your leaves and your flowers will stay inside. Now with this, I also know that I'm going to have a flower at the end. Oh, so I did 5.5 inches from end to end, and then this will trim down to 43 inches. So I want to mark it. I just really marked that wrong because I marked that at 43. That would be very bad. If I go to my center, instead of placing it, there we go, at 21.5 inches, because remember we already did that math, I want to move this over and mark it at 20.5 inches. And I am using this really large, this is a chalk marker from Boheen. It's really large and it has, there we go. That piece of chalk is really quite thick. He's maybe even bigger than 1/8 inch. He's really very nice when you want to mark something really bold, knowing that it's going to come out later. So over here on this side now, I'm going to mark that at 20.5 inches. And I marked the width already at 5.5. Now I'm going to mark each one of these to be a 5.5 inch flower section. So I know that my stem doesn't have to go all the way to the end. My stem can just go right there at the 5.5. From the center, let's see, that would be 2 3/4. My flower is going to go from here, 1, 2 3/4 to here. And then also here, this is my 20.5. I'm going to mark it at 5.5 because that is where my flower will go. So let's try and erase those. Ta-da, it's gone. Okay. Now I'm going to design where my stem is going to go. So I'm going to say that, here's the middle of it. Using this, I'm going to draw an up and a gentle down. And the same thing over here, keeping in mind that it doesn't have to be exactly the same. At least I don't think it needs to be exactly the same. If you are the type, that type A kind of type, if you think it needs to be exactly placed, you go ahead, get your little ruler out and you tell it where it's going to be. For me, it's not a big deal. Here are the 2 stems. I'm going to use my Roxanne's basting glue. And I'm going to place my stems first using small dots. So I'm going to use dots about maybe an inch apart, going right on that like curved edge that I had created for my stem. And we made this stem be 18 inches or so, which is longer than you need it. I'm just giving you a little bit of extra playroom if you want to. And that will stick that stem down. I take my iron to it and press it really nice and flat and get the glue really dry. And then we'll be ready to create the next elements for our applique border.